stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in a virtual online meeting, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era.
Along with my PhD colleague Martin Duffy, we host Talk to Your Meeting Doctors, a regular series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable. Please stand by as our show begins momentarily.
And hello, everybody. It's so good to be here today with you and again with my dear co-host, Martin Duffy. Hi, Martin.
Hi, Paul. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to be back for another session, Paul.
It's great to be here. And guess what? We have two special guests today. I'm sure that you're probably familiar with them because we've been advertising this episode since the last couple of weeks. We are very pleased to have here Karen Schmidt and Meg Bolger. Let's bring her to the studio now and welcome.
Afternoon, ladies.
Hello.
So let me do a little bit of a formal introduction of Meg and Karen. And basically, they are renowned facilitators who are known because they put their hands on creative work and they develop tools for facilitators. And namely, let me share here my screen with their websites so you can reach out to us if you are interested and curious. Meg developed the facilitator cards. I've bought my own set, and this is an amazing tool for facilitators that we are going to talk about, not about these cards, but the use we can do of these facilitator tools. And Karen also developed on their own site, which is Over the Fence. That's this original name. A number of tools that you can also buy. Decision ads, for instance, play cards, and many others that you can have here that can help you to facilitate projects and host productive meetings. So that's it for the formal introductions right now. And perhaps Meg and Karen, you would like to introduce yourselves by sharing something you normally do not disclose in this kind of public events.
Karen, would you like to go first?
Alphabetical order, Meg, and then...
Alphabetical, let me count.
it will be you, Meg.
Okay, to me, alphabetical last name. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Meg Bolger. I'm talking to you from Vermont, which is in the northeast corner of the U.S. For those who've never heard of it before, it's a small state, a rural state, and a place I love. Something I don't usually talk about. It's a big part of my life, but it doesn't come up as much in professional context, which is just that I'm a very nomadic. I've been a very nomadic person my whole life. I moved 14 times before high school and was always the new kid. And that was something that I think is interesting to see if that plays into my facilitation work these days. So finally landed where I want to be for a while, but I've never lived anywhere more than 3 years in my life. So hopefully going to change that in the next 3.
Cool.
Oh, thanks for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
How about you? Karen.
Well, I'm still impressed with the story Meg was sharing, because I thought I moved very often with 17 or 18 times, but
Okay, not a competition anymore.
so at the moment I live in Berlin, and I live here for 22 years now. I don't talk about this very often, and I grew up. We had it. We just started with that in the conversation we had before we started. I grew up in East Germany, and yeah, I had a big time changing from East to West many years ago, and so I'm kind of a person who grew up in a country that doesn't exist anymore, and maybe that's a little thing to share.
Yeah,
That's amazing. And I'm curious, Kara, what's the over the fence all about?
What is it all about? Well, we founded Over the Fence as an international innovation community in 2013. We means Frank and I. Frank is a professor here in Berlin for business, and myself. And this was because I actually was a manager for many years in my life, and a project manager and a line manager, and I did business more or less. And in 2009, I discovered the colorful world out of project management and management. And I started with doing my Scrum Master, design thinking, facilitation, and leadership development. And I always told Frank about all this cool stuff. And he said, well, Karen, how can we make this easy to use for people in projects, for people who are doing the work and suffer from, time pressure and having not so much time and the luxury to get facilitators in the room. So how can we help them with simple tools and some methods to make their life better? And that was the moment we discovered the question, actually, could be the one thing we can change or create to make the life of people and projects better? And we thought, well, wouldn't it be great if they start a project, that they start the same project, so with the same understanding of the project. So we created a project canvas where people can sit together and create shared understanding of a project. And this was in 2013, and people loved it. We made it open source, and we learned so much from the people using it that we continue to develop this thing and many other tools.
Fantastic,
So
Karen. Thank you
that's
so
the
much.
story, a bit longer story, but it was, open source. Going open source was the best decision of my life.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Why do you say that, Karen? What's the, I love open source. I think it's really powerful, but there's a lot of people who are very skeptical of putting things out in that kind of format.
If you work scientifically, you quote people if you use some source material, and Creative Commons licenses are just that. So you give credit to the people who create it, and also if you create something and give it an Creative Commons license, people like we use the very open license, share alike. You need to keep the Creative Commons version, and you give credits to the creator. Plus, if you make changes, you are allowed to change it, but you make changes visible. So that if people use your material in a different way, they can do so, but then people don't come ask you, why is it that way? And you didn't know they made some changes.
Totally.
So I think it's very transparent, and we love to reach as many people as possible in projects. And by the way, on our website, you can't buy our tools, you just get them. And you get lots of feedback from people and learn together with them, and that's great.
Awesome.
And over the fence, because each project is a big garden party where people from different professions need to work together, have fun together in order to create something.
Wow, finally, I got the answer I was looking for. Thank you so much, Karen. That's a nice name, Over the Fence. Over to you, Martin. Maybe you have some questions for our guests today, or let the conversation flow here.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm kind of intrigued, Karen, the concept of the open source and the accreditation piece of that, the power of that accreditation for new ideas, for new contributions coming in. Have you found that's the most powerful part of the open source philosophy, or how does it make commercial sense?
It doesn't make any commercial sense.
Yes, that's the best answer.
So, but you know, I'm not a seller of tools.
Yeah.
I'm not a distributor making money by selling cards. I do sell some cards in order to make them available,
Sure.
but I usually work as consultant and facilitator, and to earn €2 here and €3 there, and just is not my business model.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Meg, you're a fan of open source. Your experience of using that as a medium of communication?
I just think I loved Karen's answer of like, it doesn't make commercial sense, just in the sense that like, I don't know, there's so much business advice is just like, this is how you optimize every moment for profits. And like, that's not the only way to run a business. And I think we forget that so often, that like, you don't actually have to make every decision optimized for profits. And I think there's a lot of times where making something open source, making it something that, you know, way more people are going to interact with, like ultimately the money still works out. It just doesn't work out like in every single interaction. Or it doesn't exist in every single interaction. So yeah, I mean, I've been making online projects and resources for a decade, and all of those have been open source. All of those have been uncopyrighted and available for people to use and download. And facilitator cards are too, to an extent, in the sense that you can go on the website and see all 60 cards, you know, and if you want to make a DIY pack, and you can totally do that. And then the cards themselves, if you want like the deck, you know, in the pretty box and all that stuff, like that's where we are able to charge for it. But the information is, I don't think it's like the Creative Commons licensing I love, but also like, to me, like the information in the tools that I've created is kind of part of the commons, you know, like I didn't invent, turn to your person next to you and like have a conversation, you know, like none of us invented a pro con list, but like, it's in the deck. So to me, it's also like the wisdom of the crowd, but also like, yeah, it can be both. It can be both.
And I suppose there's an element as well when you put something out there free, inverted commas. Certainly in my experience, as often as not, and it's not the initial intention, but it always seems to pay back in some very positive way. It doesn't have to be monetary. And I think, Meg, that's probably the part of the idea that you're getting to. And certainly, Karen, that's the sense I'm getting, that it's not all about just monetary gain or monetary benefit. There are other benefits individually and then collectively that come from sharing. And that's a power to good in business, because that can make very good business sense. And Meg, as you say, the money sorts itself out. I see Mike Clargo has just commented there that, you know, the money does eventually even itself out. There's something, the title for our discussion today was Decision Tools and Facilitation. And I kind of reflected a little bit on that just before we came on air, and I was thinking they're two potentially very similar ideas, but equally they're potentially really different ideas. And the whole theory around decision making, I'm not convinced that decision making is quite as open and clear cut as everybody might like to think that it is. Your respective experiences about decision tools versus facilitation?
Well, it's an interesting, there's lots of places you could go with it. I'll just maybe start with where my brain went first. So I was working with a group of folks that lead union meetings. They try to unionize their colleagues, or they're working to unionize their colleagues. And what they need to do on a constant basis is run meetings where they bring people in, they hear their grievances, they hear the reasons that they're unhappy at work, and then they get them to make a collective decision to move forward with a particular plan, right? And that's a really high bar. That's a really high ask to get people to make collective decisions that they don't necessarily have all of the information that they need. And yeah, some of the things that we talked about was just what are the kind of different steps and stages in order to make a decision. So one of the things with one of the ways that facilitator cards are set up is that they're color coded, and the last set of cards is the red cards. These are the decision making tools. This is how you make a final answer. We want to come down to one final vote, or we want to identify all the next steps or whatever. And something I often say to people is that if you skip all the things if you skip surfacing the emotion within the group and understanding where people are at, if you don't get their input into where, what they want to see in that ideation stage, if you don't help them really understand the decision that they're making, then you won't be able to make the decision at the end of it. It's just going to get completely sidelined. And people seem to really resonate with that of oh yeah, people have these big emotions that come up right at the end, and then it completely derails our decision-making process. And I'm yeah, but if you do it earlier in the process, if you give time for that emotion at the beginning of the meeting, then you can actually make the decision towards the end of it. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's what came to mind, is just that I think some of the ways that facilitators think through a flow or a series of steps to kind of a journey to take people on, I think can be really helpful to actually making decisions at the end of the day. So yeah, that's where I went with my brain.
Karen, decisions
go
versus
in a different
facilitation.
Go in a different direction.
Yeah, my brain went even a bit earlier to a different direction. So I do facilitate, but I'm not at the first place facilitator. And we have created decision hats, which are also decision support tools, which we use and recommend to use before the meeting. So it's very simple. It's physical cards as well. And they contain, I just show them like this, 6 roles in a decision-making process. So we look, and what we mean by decision-making process is some person needs a decision, a bigger decision probably, where other people are influenced by. And those are the people you probably talk with when preparing your meetings, to facilitate. And the decision roles help you to sort out the stakes people do have in a decision-making process. And they help you to find the right meetings actually to be facilitated. So it asks who needs the decision, who wants to have the decision and starts the decision-making process, who needs to make the decision, and who's preparing the decision. That's the person we, by the way, call the facilitator. Yeah, the person who designs and manages the whole decision-making process, and also leads the preparation of the decision paper, the basis for the decision makers to decide. And these roles are pretty simple. It's 6 roles in total, but they very much help people to reflect who needs to be involved in the decision-making process and in which role. Especially, you have so many limiting beliefs in organizations, may that be traditional business organizations or any other modern form of organizing, where you have myths of decision making, like the boss needs to decide, or we all need to decide all together. And there are so many truths that are shared in organizations which are not true in itself. You need to reflect what makes sense in this situation, and this is where you can use the decision making, the decision heads, like to reflect who needs to be involved in the meetings, who needs to be heard, and who needs to decide together. Like it's a bit for bigger decisions.
It's interesting. It's interesting, Martin, if I may step in, because not necessarily these two approaches are mutually exclusive. In my view, as IAF certified professional, we have the core competencies of the IAF, as you know, and we have an important part of facilitation has to do in understanding the context for decision making, clarifying roles, and that's what Karen absolutely brings. But then you have to go to the nitty-gritty part of the process of actually making decisions, and that's where I think the facilitator cards come in very, very handy. So not necessarily mutually exclusive. Folks, you might need to buy these two sets of cards for your work as a professional facilitator. But sorry to Martin to step in on the.
No, actually, there's a key point there, Paul, that I would like to pick up. But just before I do, Karen, the 6 hats that you refer to, they're your own hats. But are they related to De Bono's 6 thinking hats concept?
Yes, there is a relation. It's 6 hats.
Yeah, that's it. That's the concept.
But it's interesting. So I presented the cards a few times to facilitators, and this association happens very often. And what you could, of course, use is to help people reflect, how would I feel in this situation as an owner or as a decision maker? You could use that. People do that and it works, but it's not designed for that. It's really about your real role in this decision-making process. Also to get clear about your role first. And, you know, the facilitator hat I showed, that's the hardest part, because this is the person who needs to find out what decision makers need to know before making the decision. And this is the person to think which experts to be involved and what kind of formats and workshops you need to make in order to get to the decision.
Yeah.
So of course, you can also use them in workshops. And this is really fun because you work with shared assumptions or individual assumptions. If you come in a room, if you have your customer was convinced we need to make this decision together. I, from time to time, work with NGOs, and they very often say, we have to decide this. And if you then just ask them, okay, for this decision, you give everyone a set of all the 6 cards with the roles, and you ask them to read the roles and just say what roles they feel to have in this decision-making process. And then you get a really interesting picture. Then you get a picture that not everyone wants to decide. Then maybe people want to be involved in different ways in this process. And you can participate in different ways. You don't have to make a decision. You don't have to make the decision altogether. In some cases, it can make sense. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense to decide altogether. It's just to find out what makes sense for the situation and for the people.
Yeah.
We have here a manifesto for the slow thinking, Martin. Have you noticed this? Manifesto for slow thinking. That's something that you're asking. Sorry about interrupting you.
There's a common thread that both of you have drawn on there. One is process, so decision-making process as opposed to decision. And the second point that both of you emphasized was emotion and the power and its significance and the importance of emotion. Can you speak to either or both of those ideas in your experience of facilitation and decision-making? Which comes first, which comes second? What's the weighted importance of the two? So decision-making process versus emotion.
I think my thought is that emotion is always part of the process, and that people, a lot of times we want it to be removed. We're just like, let's make a rational decision here, right? And sometimes that's really needed, or like that's personal like stake in it, or history that is no longer relevant but is still like affecting your experience of whatever it is. Like all of that can be desired to be put aside, right? But a lot of times people, I think, want to ignore that we are emotional beings, and that like we are emotional creatures, and would just like to be able to be like, yeah, but just like turn that off and make this decision. And I think that's a really ill-advised way to go. So to me, something I just often talk about is like, you need to make some space for it in the process. Like it needs to be involved. It doesn't need to be driving the process. There's Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and a book I love called Big Magic. She talks about like, fear is something that is always with her in her creative process. And she doesn't say that like fear can't come along, but it can't drive the bus. And to me, like there are going to be decisions where actually like emotion is like maybe the reason to make that call, where somebody's like, it just doesn't feel right. And you're like, okay, that's actually the best reason not to do it. And there's other times where it's like, I really need to be able to put aside the things that are coming up for me so that I can see this clearly. And knowing when that is true and when it's not is important. And to me, like emotion will always come along, but there's some times where it shouldn't drive the bus.
Yeah.
Interesting. Then I would like to say something about process and maybe then connect back to the emotion part. For me, process is one of the words. At Over Defense, process is one of the words which is used very differently in different professions. For facilitators, process more or less is the flow of the meeting, the opening, the ground zone, and the closing. But you do have this also on the more abstract level, like a bigger process with many meetings with all the same structure, more or less. It's depending on what's the outcome. Is it a creative process or not? And then you have the business process, which creates a result, and many people are involved. And we are kind of juggling between all them and connecting them together. So the decision-making process is, I think, closer to the facilitator's perspective of a process. Yeah. But you need to manage, like create a decision paper and do stuff. You need to produce something so that people have something in their hands in the end. And the facilitator in this process, which is not necessarily an external facilitator, but an internal person who needs to manage, who also manages the whole process. I think it's an emotional challenge, if you would like to call it that way. And this person has a lot of power in preparing the decision, because they finally decide which information goes in the decision paper, with whom to talk, and so on, and who to choose to involve in this kind of preparation process for a decision. And sometimes if those facilitator person in a decision-making process is also an expert in the topic, then they can consciously or unconsciously just apply fast thinking. Now I integrate the picture Paul was showing for the manifesto for the thinking fast and slow. So we are all trapped in our perception by our professional perspective on the world. For example, many things. We at Over Defense have used this approach also by Daniel Kahneman, thinking fast and slow, and made what we always do to make it really simple for people to get a visual reminder. And so that we say, if you work beyond the routine, that means you don't work you don't do what you always do, and you are in front of a novel challenge. So you need to leave your routine and find a process you didn't know before. Maybe it exists, but you need to invent something to get a good result. And that's what we mean working beyond routine. And in that case, we value questions before answers, observations before evaluations, change of perspective before point of view, and self-reflection before criticism. As a facilitator, this all may be, or probably certainly is, very familiar to you. For people and projects who work very fast and think very fast and make quick decisions here and there in their daily work, it's not. So for them, it helps to take a moment to reflect, what's a good question here we should think about before we get answers. Sometimes when people read the manifesto, fast thinking apply, like this selective perception, they read this before that, and and they see the Agile manifesto. It's completely different. It just reminds us to that, because it doesn't say we value answers over questions. We just we value questions over answers. We want answers, but just we want to have the good question as a means to the end to get a better answer. And that's like the meta principle. And at this place, for us, it's not so much, our focus are not so much emotions, but assumptions. All the assumptions we carry with us. And it's about creating a safe space to enjoy surprises between our assumptions and the assumptions of the others, so that we just create a space for people to speak up and do that with humor, and really to be surprised and to be open to the different perspectives of others.
Absolutely. But Martin thought about emotions, and what do you do when things then become really emotional in a meeting? Right, Martin? I think that's the topic here. Maybe
it's partly that. But I think that's in the moment, Paul. You know, so when you're in the cauldron, you're in the meeting, but there's actually was something Meg said earlier that prompted me to think on a longer timescale. So if you take decision-making facilitation out of the meeting, out of an individual meeting, and then you take the emotion point and you say, prior to a meeting, is there a precursor meeting? Is there some formative meeting? And managing the emotional kind of path through the decision-making process. From the facilitator's point of view, we might find ourselves just facilitating one workshop or one meeting. But the bit that I was curious about, prompted by Megan's point, was, but what about the emotional baggage that comes pre the event that we are facilitating? And what about the emotional content that people are charged up with following the event? We might come to a decision, discrete individual decision, but then Mike Largo joins us here, and Mike makes a comment. After the best decisions, those that everybody, are the best decisions, those that everybody has contributed to, feels is fair and is willing to support. So again, Mike's contribution prompted me to think that after the event in which we think we've made a decision, in which we think we as facilitators have brought the group to that converged point of saying, yep, decision made, but actually, is the decision enduring? And that brought me all the way back to the very beginning, where I said decisions. There's, is there such a thing really as a decision? Because we might change our minds. And if we change our minds, was the original decision really a decision? And is all of that wrapped in a cloak of emotion? Transported emotion. So is our central theme or topic here not about decision-making tools and not actually about decision process, but is it about managing emotion over time and over events, so that, as Mike says, we bring everybody along to a shared sense of outcome or shared sense of purpose and further engagement? It's a big topic. We probably need a couple of
good observations.
I think
are we managers of emotions in the end, Meg?
Well, the thought I just had is that I think it might actually be too broad, in the sense that there's, when Mike said, "Are the best decisions?" and I was like, who's evaluating what is a good decision? Like, from the company's perspective, from an individual, from the team? Like, I think part of me is like, I think we might be too abstract to be like, for me, I feel like we're too high up for me to get any good, to contribute anything like specific enough to be useful. Because I think there's a ton of different types of decisions. Like, in my business, for example, just to like to get specific, like last month we decided we're not going to spend any time on Instagram. We're not going to do any advertising. We're not going to spend any time really making YouTube videos. We're going to do something really different this month. And like, that was a decision we made, and then we acted on for the entire month of, it's July, right? Yeah. For the entire month of June, and yesterday we were reflecting, how did that go? What did we work on instead? What are all the things? And it wasn't like we had to manage emotions in the sense that like every once in a while we'd be like, are we doing the right thing? Ooh, like fear or hesitation or doubt would come up.
Discomfort,
Yeah, but there was a point of time, we made a commitment, we stuck to it for a particular length of time, and then we got to reevaluate it. So yeah, but like that decision-making process looks really different because I work in a team of 2 people, like me and one other person work in my company. And if there were 10 people, that would be a completely different ballgame, with the exact same decision to make. So like I think what's hard about talking about decisions and emotions in this kind of like high level way is that there's just, I don't love, I get pushback from my participants a lot when they're like, I don't know, it depends. And I'm like, oh, like if then we didn't narrow in enough, if the it depends is the answer, or the first and primary answer. So that's where I think I'm a little
no, that's
stuck,
fair point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I could bring to all these questions another question: what's the best decision? Maybe a decision that gets implemented, or so. But then it depends upon what kind of decision is it. If you usually you make a decision because you have an intention to change something, to make the world a better place, to create an impact or whatsoever. And for this purpose, you mostly think of more precisely of a result, something you want to create with this intention. And most of the time, if you decide then this needs to be created, also we want to create something in order to change the world, then you have people who need to do that. And if they are involved in the decision-making process, your chances are much higher than that it's possible to do that for them, because they give their opinion. And sometimes it's as simple as that. And sometimes decision-making processes fail and negative energies or emotions are created because no one talks to those people who need to actually realize the result. And they said it would be much easier if we did it the other way. But that's the whole trick to design this decision-making process in a participatory way. I think that's one reason for emotions or frustrations created by in decision-making process. The other source of negative emotions or frustrations is if you ask people to decide something who do not want to decide that because they do not feel in a position to be responsible for this situation, for this decision. And that's also, I think, a very common one.
Yeah, that concept of responsibility for making decisions versus having the authority to make those decisions. That if you carry the responsibility without the authority, you're going to feel more and more emotionally exposed because you more and more act outside your scope of authority, your ability to act. Meg, you made a really
and
telling
you can
point
just
there.
one
Sorry,
part.
Karen,
You can also call that it's a balance. Needs to be a balance of responsibility and power.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a critical. Certainly in groups that I've worked with, that's it's a question I like to pose reasonably often, particularly when people think they're approaching a decision where they say definitively we're going to do X, Y, or Z. And I like to be a little bit provocative and then say, okay, do we need permission for that off anybody? Does somebody else have to authorize that? Because if they do, have we actually made a decision or have we just made a recommendation? And if we have made a recommendation, okay, have we followed a reasonable process to generate recommendations as opposed to generate decisions? So then having that clarity as to what process are we actually involved in here, I like to provocatively put that out to, particularly if it's a group or a committee. I always like to say, who's the boss? Who did you run that by? Did you get their permission?
Yeah.
That can shorten the conversation a bit.
And the recommendation can be so much valuable, but you would really probably create it in a different way, because if you have a diverse group of experts in the room who do a recommendation, do they need to have a consensus on what is the recommendation? Maybe they have different perspectives. Maybe they can give different recommendations and just hold this that they don't fit together.
Yeah.
Do they have to convert the thing? I would question.
Yeah. I like those.
And lots of emotions there.
Yeah, and you know, certainly if you find yourself thinking initially, you're in the decision-making space. But when you work it through, you're discovering actually we're more in the recommendation space. You then might want to backtrack a little bit and say, well, if I'm going to recommend something, I might need to put forward, well, what options did I actually consider? What weighting did I give? And why am I reaching this recommendation? Because the expectation with a recommendation, I'm guessing, would be, well, it's going to be accepted. But if you want it to be accepted, so if it's tantamount to a decision, but not an actual decision, then okay, then you need to kind of stand it up a little bit. You need to justify it, back it up. And now back to your point, Karen, does that mean, so if you're explicitly going in to create recommendations, might you just re-engineer the process to get you there? Because the outcome is going to be different to a hard-nailed or a hard-nosed actual decision point.
And the emotions are different.
Yeah, absolutely.
People can give advice as experts.
Yeah.
And won't be held accountable for this decision.
Yeah.
It's different, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I like these. I think this line of questioning is an interesting one, or a worthy one, of just recommendations versus decisions. And the maybe like meta point, or the kind of like high level thing, is just like people want to know what it is we're really doing here. You know, I think there's a lot of meetings that people are like, okay, what is it you want? You want me to just sit and learn or listen? You want me to participate? You want me to give my opinion? You want me to share my emotion? Like, tell me how to show up. And I feel like that is like a really beautiful thing that facilitators can do, is to genuinely help people understand like what is it that we're trying to do here. And I think managing expectations and being clear on like what the outcome's impact is really going to be is really is really important. You know, I spent a lot of time doing social justice, DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And there were times where I would have conversations with people and they were like, well, we need to do this. We need to do this. And I was like, okay, let's say in 6 months, we come to a bunch of conclusions about all the things you need to change in your organization. Is there any space for you to do that? Do any of you have extra time in your jobs to make changes? And they're like, oh my gosh, no, we are all maxed out, 100% maxed out all the time. We barely have time to make this committee meeting work. And I was like, so the committee can't ask you to do anything. Like, it can't ask you to do anything. There's no space in the system, you know? And so I was like, until there's space in the system, or, you know, the recommendations are going to be give everybody 20% less responsibility so that we can actually make some shifts. We don't need to do the whole process, because you just told me no matter what decision we come to, you won't have the ability to implement it. And I was like, I think we just saved 6 months of time in a single phone call, because we got to the end of it where I said, can you implement any change? And they said no.
So why bother have the conversation?
Yeah. And, you know, as somebody who's a process geek, right? Like, I love process. I think process is fascinating. I think it's something that, like, wow, like you can do this and people will show up in this way, and you could do it a completely different way and the outcome would be completely different. Like, that's just something that, like, gets me jazzed, and I nerd out about as a facilitator. But process can also be really, like, wasteful, you know, where you're like, you're just going through the motions because we need to be able to say we did. You know, and that to me is like a real sad waste of time, when it's like, it's okay to go through the motions and decide actually what we're doing is exactly what we need to be doing. Onward we go. But more like we need to do it because we feel bad not doing it, but we actually have no ability to make any substantive change from any place we land. That is kind of a bummer, you know, and I think that's where a process can get abused as like a release valve for the sake of releasing pressure. I don't know if that makes sense.
Which is a very, very different purpose to what might have been originally intended.
Yeah, when the purpose of, like, we're getting together to make big changes in our organization versus, like, we're getting together to talk about big changes we will absolutely never implement, but we can't tell you that flat out. That's really, I think that's facilitation as manipulation, you know?
Okay.
Amazing. We have a few minutes left for the show to finish. And Martin, have you seen Mike's suggestion on the comments? Should we address that with the guest speakers? Should we move on? Because it's kind of deep. I can bring the question of Mike here.
Yeah. Just have a look at Mike's comment there. The facilitation tools.
Ensuring left hand side of Karen's thinking, slow side, and to the moderating emotions through that. So tools could be a blessing for a facilitator, right?
Sure. I mean, there's a host of places to go for tools. And it really depends on the type of tools you want, right? So I would say, Mike, there's a couple categories of tools, right? We both have talked about one, which is like card decks, and there's actually like a host of those out there, right? So like facilitator cards are, you know, processes that you can use, like individual structures that you can use when you're working with a group. Karen's cards, you know, the ones you showed us, I'm sure you have, there might be others as well, like help you understand the like role or mindset that you're in. There are a million sets of question cards. Like icebreaker question cards or deep thinking question cards to get into. I'm going to try to find, while Karen answers this part of the question, I'll try to find some links to send. But like card decks is just one category. Then there's books, right? Then there's like resource websites. So it depends on like, if you're like, I really need more structures to help my group move through a process, you might look in this direction. You're like, I just want people to have like physical objects to engage in a session, right? You would go to a different place. And if you're like, I want to get better at question asking, then I would also send you in a different direction. And knowing what of those things you actually want is maybe some of the hard part. But yeah, there's a lot of places to go. And I think if if Mike, you know where you have a gap that you want to fill in facilitation, then it would be easier to make a specific recommendation. But is there a way for me to put comments in the chat? Yeah.
Yes, you can share them here on our private chat in the studio,
Okay.
and then
Great. While Karen gives her
link.
answer, I'll look for some links I can send you.
Amazing.
Cool.
Yeah, well, we have 50 minutes of episode, and we need to wrap up before we close the studio for our viewers to take on their duties, as we have quite a number of followers from different LinkedIn accounts that are following us live, and I'm sure many more after the show is over. Martin, we'd like to do...
I can add one thing to what Meg just said about the different tools, because I find this question very interesting, and Meg is typing at the moment.
Yeah.
So I can say we use cards like the decision heads cards or question cards. It's itself a completely different approach than Meg's cards, because your cards, I understood, for example, the facilitator is using in order to prepare a session.
Yeah.
So our cards they are kind of, they help people break their assumptions about concepts, like business concepts that are in the room.
Yeah.
And they are colorful, they are lightful, but the stuff and content is actually really heavy. So, but just bringing those nice and colorful cards in there, addressing those big questions, helps people to take them not to, like, just maybe it reduces some fear to open up to see things from a different perspective. I think that's one of the reasons I love to create visual tools, may that be cards or posters or whatsoever. And Meg has plenty of resources also for using other stuff for getting there at this point. Yeah. And I think that's a cool thing, because another reason why I like using or creating tools, like tools for thinking, is that people can use them after the workshop as well. So in their daily life, this is how this kind of breaking the usual patterns of thought can get or emerge into an organization if people like learn using the tool and experience the value in the workshop and just take them with them in their daily work for challenges like this.
It's amazing, folks, how quickly 52 minutes can go by.
Yes,
we're probably a little over our budgeted time. Paul, I'll try and keep a wrap up here to literally 1 minute, if that's even possible.
That's fantastic.
The conversation just had. So our theme or our topic was decision tools and facilitation. At the latter part here, we just identified that while both the tools each of you primarily advocate are card-based, actually both of them in different ways are really about managing the processes of decision-making and managing people's emotions through those processes. So decision-making in its own right isn't necessarily something totally discrete. It's actually something that emerges out of a process, not only necessarily in a single meeting, but actually potentially from meetings to meetings. So handling those emotions that contribute to those decisions becomes critical. At the latter part, we introduced, or we fell across, the concept of authority versus responsibility. And that actually threw up a couple of interesting divergences and convergences in the way that we might think about it. So depending on the level of responsibility that a group or an individual has versus the authority that they have to discharge those responsibilities, now might fundamentally change the way in which we plan as facilitators any process to manage the emotions, to bring them through their, let's say, engagements. Because now recommendations versus decisions might sound very similar, but actually they can be worlds in the process to bring people to those final parts. A key point, I think, Karen, you made the key point around assumptions, that the decision-making process and the tools that you use are very often about, in a structured way and a constructive way, challenging people's preordained assumptions so that we then may look at things from a very different perspective, which ultimately may bring us to a very different set of outcomes by way of the decisions. Conscious of time, Paul, I'll leave it wrapped up at that. And as always, I leave the final comment over to yourself.
Thank you so much. But I would like to say the last word for our guests. I mean, the golden nugget from this conversation, Megan and Karen. What you take from this time we are spending together virtually?
I think I'll be thinking about that decision versus recommendation dichotomy for a bit. So yeah, helping people get clear on whether they're making a decision or making a recommendation. And the sooner you know that in the process, the better you can aim it correctly, or craft it correctly.
Karen?
Cool.
Karen?
I'm actually very inspired by Meg's passion for managing emotions during workshops, and I definitely need to get your cards.
Those are very useful. Yes, I hope that you can stay together in touch after this show, after this meeting. And thank you so much, dear viewers. Thank you, Mike, for your questions and comments. Stay tuned also for our next points of gathering. We are going to host on the Digital Collaboration Academy the digital facilitation boot camps in the summer. So watch our space here in the digitalfacilitation.eu, and also a transformation agent course that we're going to offer in September, also by applying digital tools for facilitation. I'm jazzed about this as I've discovered this expression today. Thank you so much for joining us here on episode 7. We are going to have episode 8 in August, right, Martin? Episode 8 in Asker, so stay tuned here on the channels. And goodbye all. I'm finishing now with a video to say goodbye to our dear viewers. Thank you for joining, and see you soon.
Talk soon.
My name is Paul Nunes-Dia. I am a certified professional facilitator from the IAF, which stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in a virtual online meeting, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era.